Welcome to my set of lectures, Physical Guidance in Our Perception and Behavior. My name is Ran, and I'm a PhD in chemistry. Most of my adult life I've been researching electrochemical systems and throughout the years have published numerous scientific papers in fields ranging from bioelectronics to photoelectrochemistry, from energy storage to plasmonic sensors, and so on. In recent years, I've shifted my interests to hypothesizing and writing about mechanistic aspects of human perception and perception-based behavior. As you can understand, my formal education is unrelated to philosophy or behavioral sciences. Nevertheless, the concepts to be shown in the upcoming lectures are scientifically oriented and represent my own beliefs and perspectives. I believe that my approach has various novel aspects, and in any case, I would be thrilled to hear about other related opinions and findings, and among them those which possibly support and strengthen the concepts shown herein. The next 3 videos contain 11 lectures which aim to summarize the main concepts presented in my recently self-published book, shown here, and get the ideas behind them freely accessible to everyone. If you find the principles and the concepts presented interesting, I would be more than happy if you can cite the book. Any scientific acknowledgement and reference would be highly appreciated. Here is the list of all the lectures that can be found in the 3 uploaded videos, parts 1 to 3. Before I start, I wish to note that the lectures introduce numerous hypotheses. These attempt to build up several mechanistic interpretations of human perception and behavior that, unlike traditional neurophysiology, focus on more reduced physical elements. Whereas some of the concepts will probably sound familiar to the audience, others might be perceived as unorthodox and even disharmonize with some of their beliefs. Let's start with the first lecture, which is dedicated to the coupled concepts of physics and beliefs. As I just insinuated, physics and beliefs are interlinked. One may view physics as a broadly accepted discipline that is based on beliefs. As such, parts of it are being communicated between humans, accepted or rejected, memorized or forgotten, and so on. On the other hand, we may favor to see physics as standing behind and providing potential explanations to the generation of beliefs, including those that turn it into a scientific discipline. Yet, despite the somewhat reciprocal connection between the terms, I do not assume an absolute duality between them. Adopting physicalistic perspectives, to which I will refer shortly, one may claim that physics and its laws can also exist in the absence of human beliefs, while beliefs always require a physical foundation for their existence. In this regard, we should also pay attention to the idea that fundamental physical laws do not change because of beliefs, and only our reference point for the truth concerning physical beliefs may vary and even consensually change with time. This can be exemplified by nowadays canonized heliocentric model as compared to the geocentric beliefs that prevailed among humans in the past. Another point to consider argues that since physical forces stand behind chemistry, and specifically the bonding of molecules from which biology is emerged, we may further adhere to the idea that physics also dictates the generation of beliefs in some of these living bioorganisms, at what I refer to as their minds. With that said, I can briefly mention a few beliefs about beliefs. The first point to consider is that in the specific context of this lecture, beliefs are thought to be significantly important due to their critical contribution to the process of interpreting our sensed environment and the changes we detect in it. In addition to that, beliefs also play an essential role in our decisions regarding how to react to the interpretations of these so-called external events. Another relevant concept relates to intuitive beliefs. The term is coined to symbolize an exceptional degree of consensus among humans, which is based on recurring and resembling personal experiences shared between them. One instance is our belief regarding an existence of spacetime. In my book, I used the example of reaching out and holding an object that is perceived as being located at a given position in space. Such prevalent and persistently recurring experiences allegedly evidence the presence of the perceived object as spatial contents in our vicinity. As such, they allow humans to keep reaching out to objects as they intuitively believe in their nearby tangible presence, regardless of their views of what is controlling spacetime, whether it is physics, God, or other forces. Next, I may ask, where are beliefs located in spacetime? While any possible answer to this question is debatable due to our limited understanding of conscious experiences, it can still be assumed that the most natural place for beliefs to occur would be in what we call minds. Now, before elaborating further about the human mind, I already highlight the assumption that certain parts of it correspond to special spacetime content distributions to be associated with beliefs. I refer to these distributions as beliefs encoded structures, or in short BES, and hypothesize that they play a prominent role in top-down processing activities used for deciphering sensory observations from spacetime, as exemplified by the oversimplified mechanism here on the right. In addition to the mind, we can also store other types of beliefs encoded structures on certain man-made or manipulated external to the human elements, including, for example, the server storing the beliefs presented in this video, or my book, to name a few examples. Under the right circumstances, the information kept in these intermediate assemblies can be retransferred to humans and become effortlessly decrypted in their minds. Having said that, I also acknowledge that many beliefs are dynamic in the sense that they tend to change to a certain extent with time, and from an outside perspective even seem to metaphorically struggle with each other. I will return to this struggle later on while trying to associate it with genetic energetic competition between humans. Now, I accept that beliefs are being exchanged through acts of communication, which involve various means. When humans communicate, one may describe the process as some sort of a non-perfect copying of BES between spatially separated minds. Under the appropriate conditions, the copying can turn parts of the communicator's BES distributions to slightly similar. Namely, the effective transfer of beliefs between minds is a contingent process which depends, among different other factors, including, for example, the clarity of the communicated information, on the present physical structural states of the BES distributions involved. Another concept argues that due to reliance of beliefs on past experiences, that is also depicted in the simplified mechanism shown through the assimilation and consequential reorganization of the BES arrays, and due to differences in the experiences themselves between individuals, our beliefs are always subjective. This is also true in regard to every individual's adoption of beliefs which are shared among others. I will soon refer to how such beliefs are being ostensibly normalized between humans. Next, I claim that due to our inherently shared mechanisms, we cannot disconnect our spatial perceptions from beliefs. This imposes what I call an inextricability limitation on the interpretations which continues to unawarely project on the human behavior. Now, beyond the implications of the subjectivity and inextricability limitation on the way we accept the veridicality of spacetime, namely, is this reality that we observe and perceive pristine or biased, these limitations also challenge in a way the veracity of beliefs. Thus, in a world where no interpretation is essentially truer on the absolute level than another, and the reference point for truth might change with time, I can still regard the beliefs that you will watch here as valid as any other views which possibly negate them. We should also consider that beliefs appear in our consciousness as phenomenological conscious experiences, in short, PCEs. Despite long-lasting philosophical and scientific attempts to fully comprehend these transmission-like processes, no absolute consensus has yet been reached. Nevertheless, one may assume that PCEs play a crucial part in perception mechanisms, and later on I will further hypothesize one of their potential physical roles in the human functionality. As might be expected, when approaching beliefs I favor to adhere to scientific perspectives. Whereas scientific perspectives represent certain beliefs themselves, I remind you that apart from its significant role in the dissemination and canonization of findings and views, science aspires to reduce subjectivity to the minimum possible when researching, analyzing, and predicting spacetime. One scientific principle which is relevant to the discussion is that spacetime evolution is contingent, and as such requires persistent compatibility in some physical conditions in order to circumstantially progress towards a specific direction or product. In accord with that, it is not surprising at all, for example, that overcoming energetic barriers and the requirements to match certain rules related to distributions of energetic states play a fundamental role in determining the propagation of spacetime's reactions. Another scientific belief concerns the relations between the structure of nature's contents and the functionalities which they appear to produce. We may regard structure and functionality as properties perceived and assigned by humans to referred contents in spacetime. Generally speaking, structure aims to define a distribution of inner construction characteristics. It is associated with the concept of order and has some physical implications. Functionality refers to the production of an impact, which ostensibly serves a certain purpose behind its execution. I regard, for example, the human as a functional system which generates different functionalities in a systemic mechanistic manner. As we all know, science frequently attempts to find correlations between structure and functionality. I also adhere here to certain philosophical concepts, including physicalism and materialism, which consider spacetime in all its occurrences, including the PCEs, cognition, and other mind-related processes and products, as physical and corporeal, while leaving no room for transcendental entities and explanations. I also accept the concept of causal determinism, which regards the evolution of all spacetime contents, including dynamics that we do not observe, as relying on causative progression between developing states. Given that, believing in absolute randomness in nature and/or that our life is solely and unbiasedly determined by our wills and actions may be attributed to several illusions which are common amongst humans. Now also applies to my work is the structuralist view that everything makes sense only in relation to something else. I would also like to speculate the hypothetical existence of a general spacetime, which is valid for its entire content, extending beyond what can be observed and perceived by humans over the course of time. The contents of this general spacetime might be divided at any instant to perceivable versus directly and indirectly hidden from perception through physics. Given these ideas, I highlight the assumption that the most fundamental, direct expression of beliefs and perceptions of what we basically assume as reality relies on dynamic distributions of spacetime contents that are localized in our minds, and that such distributions are being causally and circumstantially affected by observations and experiences, forming projections which are further biased by crude and transient circumstantial factors. These biases affect every individual in a specific manner, but are all physically related to the contingent evolution of general spacetime. Let's proceed to the second lecture that is dedicated to the individual human and his or her sensory responses to the external environment. I will start with a few words about the human mind. Despite the long philosophical debate regarding the essence of the mind, which probably started a few thousand years ago by Greek philosophers, we still lack some definitive and consensual answers to this matter. Even if one decides, such as in the case here, to adhere to physicalistic and materialistic views accepted by some, it would be hard for him or her to define with a great certainty what are the clear physical boundaries of the mind, and where exactly do its phenomenological conscious experiences take place. Furthermore, as the physicalistic materialistic beliefs may refer to the mind as a physical content in general spacetime, one should ask, how can it be approached and treated separately as some kind of an entity without precisely knowing or at least being able to define clearly its boundaries? Being aware to these valid challenges, I still decide to conceptually separate the individual human into mind and an external to the mind, abbreviated EM, body. Similarly, I will distinguish the entire individual from the external to the individual, abbreviated EI, spacetime. These conceptually separated spatial distribution elements are referred to in my book as distinct reference sites, and in short, DRS. The sketches shown here at the bottom illustrate the reference sites and assume the exclusive association between a specific mind and its respective external body in forming a living assembly from which human functionality is emerged. As you can see, side by side with this exclusiveness, from the viewpoint of a given individual, his or her external spacetime contains other humans with quite similar functionalities, as well as further living and inanimate objects to whom non-human functionalities can be ascribed. Now, quite expectedly, based on our scientific evidences and knowledge, it is intuitive to associate the mind with the brain and its neurophysiological processes. I will refer to this common belief as the mind-brain assumption. Yet one might also attribute to the mind some extraordinary phenomenological, functional, and structural properties which differentiate it remarkably from other body organs. These allow, at least conceptually, to separate the mind from its external body, and they include, for example, the emergence of phenomenological conscious experiences, the PCEs, integration and processing of data, including sensory inputs which lead, among other occurrences, to formation of perception, generation of decisions that shape the human behavior. One notable example in this regard is behavior directing the individual to recruit energy for the sustenance of his or her state of life and realization of other purposes to be discussed later. Based on these traits and considering an existence of structure-functionality relations, the mind and its mechanisms of operation are suspected to demonstrate an exceptional physical complexity which distinguishes them further from the rest of the human. A secondary, yet important incentive for conceptually separating the mind from its external spacetime is that such approach allows associating the distinct reference sites with respective physical events that ostensibly originate in them and lead to perception. This will be useful for my subsequent interpretations, and for this reason I enclosed the guidelines for performing such a distinction in the table below. More information about it can be found in the book. Despite the uncertainties regarding the physical boundaries and content distributions of the mind, I choose to refer to this site of interest as a distinct pseudo-entity that is latent in the individual. One way to treat the living individual assembly composed of the mind and its external body is by accepting that observations, including self-observations, are being performed on this functioning complex as a whole, namely on the summated contributions of the human mind and its external body contents. Some of these observations imply that the emergence of life functionalities from the complex requires integrated biophysical responses from both these components. Despite the necessity in their integration and without precisely knowing their interfacial physical boundaries and structures, one may still, as I mentioned before, associate the two reference sites with more distinct functional, structural, physiological, and in regard to the mind also phenomenological traits. In accord with that, we can conceptually view the living human as emerging from dynamic functions related to his or her mind and external body distributions, and even ascribe for each of them, based on our scientific beliefs, certain physical properties, including generally expressed dynamic content distributions and energies. This also implies that contrary to being treated as precise, the mind and its external individual body functions and their properties might be approached as variables whose separate, absolute physical structural solutions are unknown. Despite this assumed latency of the mind in the human, I do prefer to believe in the observations that suggest the common mind-brain correlation, and thus also in the validity of fundamental physiological principles, including the neurobiology involved in the operation of the central nervous system. This somewhat reduced interpretation will be occasionally mentioned and used herein, while acknowledging the challenges and uncertainties it holds. Following the distinction made between the reference sites, I would also like to address the possible directionality of methodic physical transitions occurring between them. Looking at the figure shown on the left, which speculates the feasibility of interactions and transfer processes between the external to the human spacetime, the external to the mind-body, and the mind of a certain human, one may notice several ideas. The first is a potential for continuity of transitions through the different sites, for example, starting and ending at the external to the human environment. This cyclic set of potential transitions is further depicted by the equation-based presentation on the right. Now looking at the incoming transition to the human, which is marked as A, and at the outgoing transitions from the human back to the environment, marked C and E, we recall the commonly accepted view of the human as an open thermodynamic system exchanging matter and energy with its surrounding. Through adopting a broad perspective that also considers the cyclic transitions, one may thus regard the living human as a dynamic biochannel which keeps mediating changes for his or her exterior in compliance with the physical dictates of the general spacetime. Looking at the scheme, the incoming transition A can be associated with both the passive and active reception of matter and energy in the individual. Such processes facilitate, among other reactions, biotransformations that activate, among other instances, metabolic cycles and sensory transitions which play an elementary role in what will be described next as sensor responses. Contrary to the incoming transfer, it is possible to link the opposite terminal, referring to the outgoing transitions from the external to the mind-body to the external to the human space, and marked here by E, to metabolic products as well as to motoric reactions which also contribute to human behavior. Looking further at the figure, one may notice my assumption that transitions from the external to the human space to the mind are always forced to cross and propagate through the body, as shown by the consecutive A and B transitions. Contrarily, reverse transitions from the mind to the external to the human space can be either mediated, as in the case of the consecutive D and E transitions, or direct, like transition C. This mind's one inlet, two outlets hypothesis regards the mind-brain correlation and views, for example, the low-frequency waves emitted from the human, which are believed to emerge from synchronized neural oscillations, as carrying, as a part of transition C, physical footprints of mind activity. This activity might be related to cognition processes and the generation of phenomenological conscious experiences. Using the crude map of potential transitions, it is possible to formulate elementary pathways of human behaviors that establish life functions, including, for example, the recruitment of energy resources from the environment. In my writings, I'm also focused on certain processes that contribute to human functionalities, and among them particularly on what I call sensor responses. Sensor responses, as implied by their name, emerge from the triggering and activation of our sensory receptors by different stimuli. In the following discussion, I will consider two linked sensor responses, sensor-perceptive and sensor-motoric, and refer to their methodic generation in the human as sensor-responsive conversion. The illustration shown here is an utterly simplified bird's-eye mechanistic view over the sensor-responsive conversion processes. By quickly examining it, one may notice that fundamental parts of the mechanism conform to commonly accepted anatomical and neurophysiological perspectives. The sensor-responsive conversion starts with the occurrence of physical interactions between external to the individual stimuli and external to the mind-body units, which yield some sort of a body projection to the environmental triggers. The projection takes the form of local physical changes in the body content, which are manifested in new structural and energetic states and regarded as the input for the process. Upon the propagation and transmuted body projection to the mind, Its transduced footprints are being systematically processed there in what can be referred to as cognitive transformations to yield different mind products. Such products are believed here to be also associated with two fundamental spatial perceptions of the environmental triggers, which will be discussed soon. Following the generation of these sensor-perceptive responses, some of their outputs participate in a broader cognitive activity where decisions regarding how to physically respond to the presence of the perceived stimuli are taken. Upon signaling the mind decisions to the body effector organs, a sensomotoric response can follow, inducing a certain change to the external to the individual spacetime. Let's zoom in a little bit on the sensor-responsive process while attempting to adhere to physiological principles and concurrently assuming the latency of the mind in the human. To this end, we may use the illustration shown here, despite it being anatomically inaccurate and only attempting to demonstrate some crude milestones along the way to producing the targeted functionalities. So in order to be able to at least semi-quantitatively analyze the methodic progression of the conversion, we first need to impose a certain hypothetical limit on the sensory triggering of the human body. For this reason, we can define a limited duration, such as delta t trig, during which a given individual will be exposed to some sensory stimuli. I will refer to the overall triggering events during this period as a combined stimuli cluster and attempt to follow the subsequent changes the reception of this cluster is inducing in the human. As the cluster of physical stimuli is continually approaching the frontal body units that activate the exteroreceptors, it can be described by a time-dependent projective distribution function. This projection of dispensing stimulation sources in the environment, to which I call projection of arrival from spacetime, encodes the intrinsic physical nature of the stimuli that normally correlates with the type of the receptors activated, as well as the stimulus intensities and directions of arrival. Now, upon a successful interaction that requires physical compatibilities between the stimuli and the receptors, a body reception projection is obtained. The projection corresponds to the physical footprints left in the body throughout the ongoing stimulation process and which encode the arrival characteristics of the stimuli that have been successfully received. An afferent neuroconduction of the localized body's changes from the peripheral to the central nervous system is then carried out, abiding by different neurophysiological principles. One renowned principle that is worth mentioning is the neural tuning, which correlates the specific neural assembly triggered with the characteristics of the triggering stimulus, and hence might also imply an encoding of the arrival characteristics in the specific conduction path. I should also note that due to the conceptual separation between the external to the mind body and the mind, I deliberately distinguish between two conduction regions in the body and in the mind. The distinction presumes a latent border that is arbitrarily dividing the reference sites and which is not associated with any specific anatomic entity. Then, upon what I call injections of the propagating changes to the ever-changing mind, some of their ostensibly neural projections are transmitted as PCEs, generating a direct, cognitively unprocessed sensation of the triggers. I base this assumption on different common experiences, including noticing differences in the richness of details upon comparing the pristine sensation and its perception, as well as on experiencing time delays between the two. Following the sensation starts the top-down cognitive processing of the evolving mind inputs. This complex stage is believed to produce several interlinked core perceptions that allow the subjective interpretations of the stimuli. Different cognitive byproducts which are being formed during this process can be associated with additional mind projections and PCE transmissions to the consciousness of the individual. Then, a stage of what can be referred to as higher cognition processing takes place, where decisions regarding behavioral sensor responses to the stimuli are also frequently considered. When applicable, the mind footprints, which are associated with the decisions, and that are commonly believed to be encoded in neural signals and their conduction paths, are then being efferently transmitted to effector body organs. The latter execute the encoded instructions to implement the sensomotoric human behaviors. Now, the analysis of the propagating projections involves many time-related and other complexities. Among these, we can indicate, for example, the nonlinearity in the overall conversion, which also reflects some of the ongoing physiological and mechanistic methodic biases, as well as the influences of the often related body and mind events. In view of these overarching impacts, it is quite difficult to accurately and definitively correlate every perceptual or behavioral output to a specific sensory trigger. Nevertheless, we may still treat many of the projections as dynamic distributions of action potentials and other cell or biochemical potentials that contribute to a sort of a contingent continuum of energy transfers and structural changes. From a deterministic viewpoint, such rapidly changing footprints are linked causally and circumstantially and can be viewed as entwined by the individuality dimension to be discussed next. One interesting characteristic which can be coupled in principle to any spatial content perceived as producing functionality is the individuality dimension. In referring to it, I will use a notation of a dot over the element or variable to which this individuality characteristic applies. Let's consider, for example, the sensor-responsive conversion process. One way to approach the ongoing changes in the human caused by the reception of the external stimuli is to adopt a reductionist view. Accordingly, we may scrutinize macro-level propagating local changes to be referred to here as traveling disturbances from a physical rather than physiological perspective. This further allows depicting time-dependent specific progression trajectories, which are composed of an immense yet finite number of consecutive physical changes and sequential reactions. Now, two important points should be mentioned in regard to these macro sensor-responsive conversion reactions. The first is that many of them take part in establishing what can be considered as the higher level, or if you like meso, operational states of the physiological system, and as such they are often being repeatedly activated and regenerated. Thus, one may consider some sort of a confined variation spectrum of states among humans, which reflects to a certain extent their genetic-directed systemic and functional similarities. The second point is that in compliance with the fundamental physical dictates and laws of general spacetime, each of the microscale reactions has its own energetic barrier and other compatibility demands to activate and contribute to the progression of the sensor-responsive conversion. Continuing with the individuality dimension of the human, one can hypothetically link it, for instance, to a specific triggering element, exposure interval to stimuli, or to the human functionality produced. In the case of the sensor-responsive conversion process, this projective measure corresponds to the unfolding physical structural distribution in the individual's body and mind trajectories during the generation of the responses. As expected, the trajectories follow the circumstantial propagation of the traveling disturbances via the microscale reactions establishing the conversion. Now, from a practical standpoint, it needs to be emphasized that it is impossible to measure and thus know the absolute values of the individuality dimension. Some of the reasons for that are related to physical restrictions as well as to probabilities and uncertainties which become significant at the microscale quantum level, as even the most ideal observations, which might already consider collapse of wave functions, cannot be accounted for yielding fully reliable projective indications for macro-scale physical changes. The absolute individuality dimension must be considered as a purely hypothetical property, and which is also restricted by our scientific interpretations of the distributions it entails. Nevertheless, treating it with the essentially required carefulness, the individuality dimension allows us to speculate certain aspects of functional systems. For example, in view of the physiological and other systemic complexities involved in the generation of the sensor responses, it is possible to predict that the human individuality dimension, and thus also the functioning individual human himself or herself, will always remain unique in spacetime. Namely, despite the existence of variation spectra in certain content distributions of humans, in this context the individuality property is assumed to reflect the uniqueness of every individual producing life functionalities. We might also realize that past events in the life of the individual and their subsequent mind assimilations contribute to this individuality expressed uniqueness, also through altering the beliefs encrypting structures that affect the conversion process in the mind. Speaking of human individuality and uniqueness, I would like to expand the discussion by mentioning a few related ideas to be combined under the general term broad individuality. One concept corresponds to a situation where internal reactions that participate in the conversion process start impacting forthcoming sensory reception processes, and in a generalized form, it is a situation where a system is enabled to affect its own inputs and even its future individuality dimensions. This can be exemplified by an intentional closing of the eyelids to yield a systemic state which, at least temporarily, does not facilitate light-based excitation of photoreceptors and generation of vision. Another concept which is relevant to the broad individuality relates to restrictions over spatial orientation and their effect on perception. It is well known that due to anatomical and physiological limitations, we humans cannot condense and simultaneously occupy the exact same place. To a certain extent, this restriction resembles the intrinsic limitation over the condensation of fermion particles in nature, with some analogy between the momentary quantum state of the fermion and the transient individuality of the human. Now, one implication of this spatial restriction is that all individuals are destined to sense the external environment with at least some minimal discrepancies between them. Over time, the different orientations can contribute to accrued differences in beliefs which hold a potential to further affect outcomes of perceptions. Using the analogy with the fermionic particles, this concept can be referred to as a fermionic-like limitations on perception. Accordingly, even if two identical persons could exist at a certain point in time, fermionic-like limitations would contribute to gradual deviations in their assimilated mind structures and consequently affect their personal interpretations of experienced events. Given all these, one can ask if human sensory responses are also always unique. One simple way to test this question is to conduct an experiment in which several individuals are asked, each in turn, to stand at a fixed position from a stationary trivial object, such as the one displayed here right to the visual input title, and to identify it by using a few words. Under these exposure conditions, a similar answer among two or more participants recognizing the exhibit, for example as a red ball, might indicate that sensory responses, including the sense of perception of spatial elements, are not necessarily unique. This can lead one to wonder if the previous claims that each of us is structurally unique and that our structure determines our perception and behavior are still valid. In fact, there are several reasons accounting for the similar answers in the experiment, and among them I would like to mention the patterned nature of our spatial perception and the use of patterned and limited verbal expressions to describe the observation. Both of these play a part in normalizing the answers given without defying the assumed structural uniqueness of the participants in the experiment. Now, it is clear that the variance in the answers is expected to rise upon increasing the number of participants and when including, for example, in the test group, short-sighted, colorblind, sedated, or any other individuals who retain, in quotation marks, bias from the norm states. Divergent answers are naturally also expected from inexperienced infants or hypothetically from plateau cave inhabitants who have never experienced anything like a red ball before. Diversity in the responses is also envisaged upon requiring more details to be elaborated. such as, for example, regarding the exhibit's texture, size, hue, and so on. This would also be the case if the ball is replaced by a more abstract object, which is less likely to be identified through trivial recognition patterns, or alternatively by exchanging the request for verbal responses with monitoring less normalized outputs produced by the participants. One alternative response may include, for example, the emission of neural oscillations of different frequencies whose spectra can be recorded during the exposure. As one can understand, the red ball type of experiment also highlights the power of communication and its normalization capabilities in effectively bridging between spatially separated human minds, exchanging space-time interpretations. Let's return to the scientific view of the living human as an open thermodynamic system that is exchanging matter and energy with its surrounding. As was previously implied, these lifelong transitions can be regarded as resulting from a multitude of circumstantial contingent events in general spacetime. Based on this interpretation, one can ascribe to any given individual an equation of dynamic balance, which is projecting on what I call his or her individual human energy at every instant of life. Looking at the equation, one can see that it contains two fundamental terms. On the left side, we notice an energy projection of the hereditary nucleus from which the human life functions are believed to emerge. Biology identifies this nucleus with the zygote assembly and its 46 chromosomes donated equally from the biological parents of the individual. It is common to associate this specific content distribution with the initial state of the individual's life, emerging at what I mark by the beginning of the individual time and refer to as individuality marked T0. The reason for this association stems from the active self-organization functions observed for the assembly and which are absent from its egg and sperm cell sources before the fertilization. Adopting a broad perspective, we may view the hereditary nucleus as a transient assembly whose exact structure and hence biophysical properties causally and circumstantially project on the entire physical biological evolution process, a process that has started long before its emergence and the onset of the individual time it marks. On the right-hand side of the equation, it is possible to notice an additional term which corresponds to the time-dependent energetic development of the referred human, and thus also of his or her individual nucleus, with respect to the lifelong interactions he or she has been conducting with the external spacetime. This evolution is indicated by a dynamic energy projected balance of incoming and outgoing transitions whose accrued value at any observation instant marks the human energy of the unique individual at his or her present individual time in life. One may further understand that the time-integrated inwards and outwards transitions DEST in and DEST out can be associated with different events over the course of the individual life. Now, bound to the maturation process and the increase in the individual time, the energetic contribution of the hereditary nucleus to the total human energy is assumed to decrease. This general tendency is expected at least until around the time when our bodies stop growing. Furthermore, the relative decrease clearly does not contradict the greater importance of the initial genetic content to laying and setting out the human anatomy and physiology, as well as to impacting some of the energetic transitions throughout our lives. Another point to consider in regard to the human functioning as an open thermodynamic system is the mandatory existence of a continuous interplay between his or her internal structural changes and the energetic transitions occurring with the external environment. I also note that the sensor responses provide only one of several contributions to the total energy balance. This means that only a part of the incoming transitions DEST in consist of external sensory stimuli and part of the outgoing transitions DEST out are behavioral outputs which are used, for example, for recruitment of more incoming resources to sustain the state of the individual's life. In this regard, it is important to mention that while some incoming transitions require an investment of self-effort, namely energy, by the individual, others are driven by external forces and thus can be viewed as spontaneous on his or her behalf. I would also like to mention that by employing the aforementioned hypothesis for a single mind inlet and two potential outlets, a similar formulation, like the one shown here, can also be used in referring specifically to the energy of the mind. Next, I would like to discuss the effects of certain life events introduced in the following table on the individual human energy. The first seminal event has just been mentioned, and it refers to the appearance of the hereditary nucleus in the fallopian tube of the individual's carrier mother. The energy associated with this zygotic state at the onset of the individual time is marked by E inherited, case 1 in the table, and the specific content it corresponds to can be considered as pre-functional, as it encodes the information from which hereditary physiology and functions are to be expressed and developed in the human. Following the emergence of the nucleus, an intensive biological activity is set to grow and protect the developing life seed. I regard this activity as generating construction conservation functionality, abbreviated as CCF, that precedes the establishment of cognitive mind functions from which perceptive-based sensor responses are evoked. In accord with that, I also disregard during this preliminary stage any mind activity that still cannot contribute to perception-based behavior, in short PBB, and tend to associate the individual human energy mainly with the growing human body, namely through equating E-human and E-body, as presented in case 2 in the table. Now, at a certain individual time, defined as T0 mind, the mind is assumed to reach a stage of development in which emergence of elementary cognition functions supports and initiates the formation of perceptive-based sensor responses. From that moment on, I view the individual as conducting both CCF and PBB, possibly in addition to other functionalities which might be less relevant for this discussion. In accord with that, the individuality-oriented formulation at this stage starts considering the fundamental contribution of the mind to the life functionalities, which allows treating E-human as equal to the sum of E-body and E-mind, as presented in the third case in the table. I further note that most humans spend a major part of their lives in this structural functional dynamic state, and that this period typically also includes the event of the individual's birth. Finally, every human dies at his or her individual time T-death. Upon the irreversible physiological malfunctioning of the body and mind systems, the collapse of the conversion process, and consequently of its dependent individuality dimension, occur in the human. The collapse of the individuality is marked via the arbitrary nullification of E-human, as well as by the transitions of the individuality marked E-body and E-mind to the E-body measure, which is lacking the dot notation, as can be seen in case 4 in the table. In other words, the chosen formulation favors associating life functionality with individuality and correlates it with positive E-human values. Following the death of the human, the remaining individuality lacking body product, which still possesses some general spacetime potential energy, is being gradually degraded by chemical and biochemical transformations in accord with the transition marked here by E-body goes to EST. Next, in the description of the formation of the sensor responses, I will present several assumptions regarding the process of sensation and the emergence of what can be called classical perception in the human individual. In the last lecture, I talked about elementary human energetics and individuality and performed a conceptual distinction between the external environment and the individual's mind and external body. These and other related assumptions, as well as common physiological beliefs, allowed me to address in general the propagation tracts of sensory footprints across the distinct reference sites of the human on the way to produce sensor responses. The propagating changes and their milestone projections were assumed to evolve under individuality reflected and deterministically controlled physical progression. With these concepts in mind, I will focus from now on, as illustrated by the right corner panel, on mind processes believed to establish our perceptions, decisions, and perception-based behavior. I would like to present now an important assumption which considers the mind activity involved in the formation of the sensor responses as based on a set of integrated processes that seamlessly produce layered-like, sequential phenomenological conscious experiences in the individual. I associate the experienced layers with the sensation of the direct mind projection, which is corresponding to the external sensory stimulation of the body receptors, a classical space-time perception, abbreviated as CP, and considered to be a core spatial perception. Another core spatial perception, the energy perception, abbreviated as EP, and whose formation requires an interplay with the classical perception. The energy perception is conjugated to what can be considered as high cognition processes, which are believed to be in charge of higher complexity assessments that yield further PCE expressions, such as thoughts, decisions, and others. These are also believed to be crucial for the perception-based behavior of the human. Given these, I believe that we observe and interpret our external world via an augmented reality resembling integrated experience of phenomenological expressions atop a basal pristine sensation layer. I will now briefly refer to each of these experienced segments and their specific contributions to the sensor-responsive process. I begin with the basal PCE layer and associate it with the sensation of the environment by the direct, transmission-like process of the mind's sensory projection. I remind you that this projection is assumed to be formed by the external stimulation of the body and specific conduction of its physical structural footprints to the mind. Looking at this assumption, one may notice that it implies a chronological separation between the sensation of space-time and its perceptual interpretations. Such separation relies, among other possible indications to its veracity, on our occasional experiences of delays between direct observations of spatial elements and their belated identification. Another intuitive reason to support this assumption relates to the large number of spatial features and details which are typically evident during the sensation, yet are missing interpretations during their pattern perception. This assumption extends beyond what I will refer to later as genetic lensing and insinuates that the density of processed sensory information can only decrease along the sensor-perceptive tract, thus chronologically placing perception after sensation. In view of this, the sensation can be regarded as some sort of a pre-perceptive phenomenological layer, a consciousness precursor which relies on a pseudo bottom-up transmission solely based on incoming crude multi-sensory information. Taking into account the layered sensor perception hypothesis, this also implies that the sensation itself does not involve cognitive processing of the sensory information it reflects. Another point to consider is that the sensory mind projection ascribed to the sensation can be associated, based on the hypothetic mind-brain correlation, with some neural structures in wired cortex regions, including, for example, the retinotopic map projections of the visual field. I further wish to emphasize that during the state of wakefulness, the process yielding sensation could be instantly refreshed at a very high rate, which is directly correlated with the intrinsic properties of the human physiology. Being accustomed to the experience, we are often unaware of any possible quantization or delays in the sensation and tend to regard it as continuous. Another possible assumption that might not sound fully intuitive to all is that phenomenological transmissions in general, and among them the sensation PCEs, help releasing an excess of sensory energy accrued in the human mind. This speculated release pathway, which is possibly enabled through coupled neural oscillations, may occur in parallel to efficient physiological dissipation processes. A physical reasoning in the form of a targeted mind energy release can help the attempt to address the question, why do we experience space-time at all? This seems to be a valid question, as one may believe that our decisions and physical responses to the world can also follow a more robotic route, requiring no phenomenological experiences, yet taking advantage of similar assessment mechanisms. I would like to note that the book refers to several other possible reasons for the occurrence of PCEs, and that this assumption, considering the sensory energy release, will be considered again in Lecture 8, which discusses the concept of behavioral states. Before introducing the next conversion steps in the mind-focused formation of the sensor responses, I would like to dedicate a few words in the context of the discussion here to cognition. Cognition provides us, among the different products its processes generate, with interpretations of spatial elements and their changes. In my book, I examine some methodical cognitive assessments which apply to these. To this end, I attempted to describe the operation mechanism behind the assessments using a set of mind operators that act on different mind content distributions, some reflecting the sensory triggered projections in our focus here. Now, if we imagine our daily conscious experiences as some sort of an ongoing film in which we normally take and share with other entities active roles as script writers, directors, actors, cameramen, watchers, and critics, it is possible to regard certain aspects of cognition as assessing and interpreting this film's projected script in our minds. I will soon claim that some of the cognitive assessments used in such interpretations are inherently directed to address specific topics which relate to our genetic motivations and the fundamental life goals they aim to fulfill. With that said, I still believe that despite the cognitive mechanisms and their mind operator presentations being hereditarily common to all humans, their effective impact on the sensor responses is circumstantial and specific. This can be reasoned by the specific reception characteristics of the sensory inputs and the individual's accrued assimilations of past experiences. The next layer is believed to succeed sensation and is referred to here as the individual's classical perception, and in short CP. I consider the CP as the first of two core spatial perceptions. It is hypothesized to be holding a fundamental function in assessing and recognizing objects, identities, properties, relations, dynamic situations, and other interpreted features in the mind projection of the direct sensory reception, from which the sensation PCE is being transmitted to the consciousness. I further assume that not all parts of the sensory mind projection are being assessed at once, but rather that in every moment the mind is focused on certain points of attention, to which I refer to as basic consciousness foci, and in short BCF. Quite naturally, these kind of potential assessment nuclei appear to leave, at least temporarily, other parts of the sensory projection in the background of any given assessment. The processes of association of BCF to assessment clusters and their circumstantial updating while experiencing the environment are succinctly addressed in my book, and I will therefore skip their discussion here. Next, I regard the cognitive assessments participating in the classical perception as based on top-down processing mechanisms. The latter utilize mind-stored information, including previously assimilated beliefs encrypted structures from past experiences. At this stage, I prefer to leave the explanation of the CP to experts in the fields of brain and cognitive sciences. I do so while acknowledging their immense contributions to exploring many of its physiological, psychological, and other aspects. With that said, I may still regard the classical perception as based on a black cognitive toolbox which directs several mind functions in performing a multitude of top-down comparisons between elements from transient sensory projections and stored information from past experiences. Such functional tools can be related, for instance, to various memories, storing information on diverse timescale levels and serving as different references for the comparisons, imagination, hypothetically flexing the comparisons by exposing the collated elements entailed to fluid association patterns, and concentration, allowing localized and focused processing of specific and narrower mind distributions. Despite my decision to extenuate in my works the next spatial core perception, I wish to add at this stage several further assumptions regarding the CP. So some further assumptions to consider are: the CP interprets many events that are external to the individual. While doing so, it is assumed to conduct a methodic interplay with other perceptions. One important example relates to the CP both utilizing and simultaneously assisting the ongoing establishment of what I call the spatial self-perception of the individual. The spatial self-perception is believed to serve as a dynamic reference to the film-like experience of the individual's life. It does that from a viewpoint which resembles to a certain extent a singularity towards which spacetime is converging. I further assume that two types of cognitive assessments, to be referred to as transient and overarching, are being used by both of these as well as other perceptions. While transient assessments rely on direct and possibly also bottom-up evaluations regarding the immediate incoming sensory data, overarching assessments are based on top-down estimations employing experience-acquired beliefs in causality, repetitiveness, stability, relativity, and the like. Another point to consider is that the classical perception does not only attempt to decipher the identities and properties of the consciousness foci, but it also aims to predict their short and occasionally long-term changes. The next assumption returns to the hypothetic mind-brain correlation and claims that the cognitive interpretations of the foci do not depend on back-decoding of the neurally wired tracts in which the received sensory information was conducted. Accordingly, no pinpointing of the specific receptors that have been activated by the arriving stimuli is carried out. In this regard, I believe that the extended individuality state of the human and its reflections on this one-way physiology reduce the probability for a scenario involving the perceptive mind operators using some sort of a genetic key to back-decode the accurate activation-conduction path and bottom-up interpret spacetime accordingly. The fourth point argues that despite the sensor perception being solidly correlated with the external to the individual contributing physical sources and events, its generation is still subjective, and as such, its interpretations cannot be considered as reliable from a physical viewpoint. Contributing to this subjectivity are also the nonlinear sensor-responsive conversion and its susceptibility to a complex set of biasing influences, some acting from within the human system. Next to be highlighted is that many CP interpretations are accompanied by verbal descriptions. Most of these lack vocal expressions and remain uncommunicated, yet they still participate in, or even assist in promoting, high cognition processes such as thinking and decision-making that precede the emergence of perception-based behavior. Finally, I assume that the CP does not impart any significance to the spacetime objects it identifies. In fact, I believe that a meaning layer is being derived and incorporated to the total perception experience only during the subsequent methodical stage, which aims to assess the potential contribution of the recognized objects to the realization of the individual's genetic goals. The next lecture presents one of the most important parts of this theory, hypothesizing the existence of the individual energy perception and its conjugated high cognition assessments. Introducing the individual energy perception, abbreviated as EP, I will begin by postulating that this core interpretation of spacetime associates, via their assessed foci, CP-recognized objects and situations with several human motivations to fulfill, ameliorate, and conserve different inherent goals. Due to the soon-to-be-discussed hereditary nature and orientation of the goals, they will be referred to as, in quotation marks, genetic. Now, the assessment and prioritization of the basic foci with respect to the genetic goals is believed to yield some sort of a motivation layer, imparting to the spatial elements under consideration graded energetic genetic significances from the viewpoint of the assessing individual. These mechanistic products are then transmitted to the consciousness to yield a unique phenomenological experience that is expressed over the CP-based interpretations of spacetime. I remind you that both of these perceptive layers are believed to be sequentially expressed atop a basal sensation experience. With that in mind, I further assume that the EP layer and its respective mind projection also serve as a precursor for subsequent high cognition estimations regarding possible behavioral responses to the more energetically genetically meaningful objects assessed. If these decisions and actions could have been unbiased, they would always aim to enhance the state of the individual with respect to the fulfillment, amelioration, and conservation of the genetic goals and his or her related achievements in this regard. Which genetic goals play a pivotal role in our individual energy perception of spacetime and sensor perception-based behavior? The first and most expected goal is the survival of the individual. One basic manifestation of survival is the continuity of internal body and mind processes in producing life functionalities. The sustenance of these also depends on the abilities to sense the environment and to respond to it, expressing behaviors which advance functionalities like construction conservation of self-structures and conservation and improvement of genetic achievements. Furthermore, with respect to the rest of the genetic goals and to the other humans involved in them, the conservation and the improvement can be regarded as applicable to what I call the individual ecosystem of the human. The second genetic goal relates to replication. Replication and survival are clearly linked at the species level, but when it comes to the individual, implementing the former is not necessarily essential to the latter. In a similar way to all other goals, I believe that the individual is genetically urged to act, in this case to reproduce, also from the pristine structural level of his or her body-mind content. A further similarity between the goals relates to the required investment of behavioral energy, namely work, and time of life in their realization. As we all know, in the case of the replication, this investment typically concerns finding an appropriate partner and establishing necessary social, emotional, and financial connections with, through employing different resources for this matter. The third goal is ascribed to critical guardianship. It refers to watching and protecting the individual's utterly dependent offspring during his or her first years of infancy and providing him or her with critical energy resources to sustain life. Such behavior is a part of what was referred to as the conservation of the individual ecosystem. The implementation of the fourth goal, which I call enhancement, begins once the offspring has matured to the point that guardianship is not critical anymore and he or she starts possessing some semi-autonomous capabilities in recruiting energy and protecting himself or herself. The inherent goal of the guardian individual at this stage is to further ameliorate the offspring, and by doing so to increase the implementation potential of this benefitor towards realizing his or her own, and potentially also the dynasty's, genetic goals. In this sense, the enhancement can be viewed as a species benefiting behavior. Looking at the different goals from a broad perspective, the last three, and especially goals 3 and 4, which involve guardianship, can be perceived as requiring activities in which the individual serves as a realization catalyst to certain other individuals. Furthermore, unlike the first three goals whose main objective is conservation of the self, of the species, and the offspring, the enhancement is mainly oriented towards improvement, yet with conservation implications that might follow. I also know the different aspects of enhancement can be regarded as unique to humans in the living world. Now, the introduction of these goals draws our attention to the persistent energetic struggle over spatial resources, which is taking place amongst the humans engaged in the realization of the goals. Whereas the struggle seems to be pronounced more aggressively in local habitats where demands for resources are high and their availability is changing fast, it encompasses, however, the entire race and is being reflected through various human interactions. One prominent consequence of the struggle is the formation of polarization, namely inequality between individuals with respect to the resources that they can potentially invest at a given moment on their genetic goals. This is occasionally evident through the difficulty or inability of the weaker individual to realize the 4 genetic goals and especially to enhance his or her benefiters adequately, or at least better than the majority of their weakest competitors in the local habitat. Such instances can be linked to evolutionary concepts along the lines of natural selection. Another important point is that despite the fact that we are ostensibly hardwired to pursue the genetic goals, our behavior often defies them and in some cases even contradicts their essence, with the most obvious example shown by an act of suicide. This implies that the natural propensities can be largely biased by certain individuality-impacting physical events which sometimes overpower the inherent behavioral guidance. As physics is not obligated to be in favor of biology, physical events which do not comply with the hereditary plans and as such trigger non-genetic behaviors leave their footprints in the human mind. Some of these are induced by what I will soon refer to as individual psychoenergetics. Furthermore, decisions to act in a certain way, which might look anti-genetic to an outside observer, are also frequently affected by prioritization of the goals, objective time limitations for implementation, pathologies, and so on. Hence, anti-genetic behaviors disharmonize with the biophysical plan embedded in the human machine, and might look like a failure from the viewpoint of the species, yet they do not negate the plan's physical feasibility as a whole and the general physical evolution of nature. The next step in hypothesizing the principles of operation behind the energy perception involves discussing the concepts of psychoenergetics and perception of the energetic self. Before the explanations, I would like to note that in contrast to the straightforward, in quotation marks, organic, purely physical nature that has been ascribed so far to the term energy, from now on I will mainly refer to it in the context of the energy perception from a broader perspective. Despite always considering energy as a universal property of spatial content, when it comes to dealing with the EP and its related concepts, the term also represents beliefs regarding resources and potentials which have previously been, are presently being, or can be exploited to implement or empower the inherent genetic goals. Despite assuming that some of the perceived resources and potentials indeed hold tangible fundament in the materialistic physical world, due to the enhanced subjectivity involved in their perceptions, their interpretations will not be regarded in general as physically reliable and veridical. As said, next to be presented is the concept of psychoenergetics. I believe that this hypothesized idea is broad enough to be expanded into a full lecture by itself, yet I will try to limit the discussion here mainly to its relevant contributions to the individual energy perception. Generally speaking, psychoenergetics corresponds to a wide range of influences affecting the formation of the human perceptions and behavior. These are triggered by real or imagined events which are specifically considered to be impactful from our current broader viewpoint of the term energy. As such, psychoenergetics can be viewed as one component in an overarching set of biases which determines some of our most fundamental sensor-responsive functionalities, while making it hard for us to let go of the illusion that we act out of free, unbiased will. An elementary example of psychoenergetic biases relates to energy-impactful events which evoke fears. Let's scrutinize, for instance, one's birth. The sudden separation from the intimate surroundings of the mother's womb is accompanied by an abrupt discontinuation of the energetic provision and requires the baby's fast adaptation to new habitat and survival practices. The overwhelming experience is preceded by a rough physical detachment transition, exposing the baby during the delivery to friction and pressure levels never experienced by him or her until this moment. Regardless of how complication-free the delivery might seem to the outside observer, as in most cases of cesarean sections for example, and even if it is quite hard to recognize its emotive impact on the newborn immediately after the birth, the transition from the half-bosonic-like configuration in the mother's womb to the external, fermionic-like state is expected to dramatically trigger the infant's sensory and mind systems. In accord with that, one can assume that the birth experience and the difficulties accompanying it leave a significant mark on the individual's mind as they induce a strong emotion identified here with an elementary fear, which I refer to as the fear of absolute abandonment. One common impact on the birth experience, which is assumed here to exist in all humans, concerns emergence of primordial beliefs associated with the transition between the two energetic states prior and after the delivery. Adopting an open-mind perspective, I believe that experiencing the entire transformation is somewhat analogous to sensing some fundamental aspects of the energy barrier needed to overcome the biophysical transition. Accordingly, I assume that at a very early stage of life, all humans observe certain elementary facets of the general spacetime's laws, a process required for the maturation of their energy perception. This idea is related to some important hypotheses to be described here later on. The fear of absolute abandonment intersects with another fear, the fear of death, which contrarily and normally does not begin near or at birth. In most cases, the individual becomes aware of the concept of death only at later stages of his or her life. The acknowledgement is often carried out via mediated learning, which triggers imagination-driven processes. As with the experience of the birth, the exposure patterns in both these cases are individual, and their unique assimilation impacts humans differently. Defining the fear of absolute abandonment and the fear of death as core fears, I believe that their combinations are reflected in all incidental fears encountered by the individual throughout his or her life. Continuing with psychoenergetics, I would like to expand the topic of experiencing fears to discussing the more general concept of emotions, assuming that the latter play a crucial role in the energy perception. Upon growing up, the rapid increase in the individual's volume of interactions with space-time content exposes him or her to experiencing a broad spectrum of phenomenological conscious experiences referred to as emotions. Each emotion can be regarded as a vector holding specific magnitude, which reflects the intensity of the experience, and direction. The direction is intuitively correlated with our general experiences of pleasure that can be arbitrarily associated, for example, with a positive orientation, and suffering, which would be respectively linked to a negative orientation. Based on that, I relate certain negatively associated emotions to failures in conserving or improving genetic goals, and conversely positive emotions to successfully conducting conservation improvement interactions with CP-recognized spatial objects while ameliorating or at least preserving one's own genetic energetic state. Similar outcomes also apply to predicting potential success or failure for such interactions. In addition to that, emotions may further correlate with the self-investments expected in the interactions, where large and/or prolonged efforts normally evoke negative, even if occasionally low-magnitude, emotive expressions. The different vectorial combinations of emotive directions and magnitudes are often given crude lingual expressions which are bound to vocabulary limitations and their connections to narratives and assimilated experiences. These expressions normalize in quotation marks the emotions in lingual patterns that are being communicatively shared and then interpreted by others. Based on these concepts, I argue that emotions are PCEs which emerge upon exposure to certain mind external to the mind-body and external to the individual space-time events. I speculate that one of their basic functions is to serve as core systemic indicators for immediate energetic assessments of different elements spatially associated with them in these or in other events. In regard to that, I expect that in a somewhat similar manner to the spatial recognition of objects by the classical perception, the emotion-based indicators rely on memory-assisted comparative processes. These require previous mind assimilation of expressed emotions, presumably in the form of emotion-encoded structures to be abbreviated as EMES, accompanying directly observed and/or communicated consequences of different successful and failed genetic conservation and improvement interactions. One may assume that the emotion-encoded structures are memorized in designated assemblies, like an emotive memory, that they change with new experiences, are susceptible to consolidation and reconsolidation processes, to forgetting, and so forth. Now, experiencing a certain event can evoke different emotion vectors. The specific emotive combinations expressed depend on the conditions entailed in the situation observed, and among them on the broad individuality dimensions of the observer. Despite assuming that every emotive combination is not expressed only as a single sum of weighted average emotion, I still acknowledge that these contributions tend to be experienced with a certain dominance of more positive or negative and higher intensity emotions. I should also emphasize that emergence of emotions is coupled with both external sensory and mind events. The latter suggests that the individual can also be flooded with emotions while experiencing situations which to us, the outside observers, might not seem capable of changing his or her energetic genetic state. Such events typically employ imagination-driven associative interpretations that may involve, among many other examples, identifying with external to one's own ecosystem situations, as well as projecting from the self on others. In this context, I further assume that during exposure to external events, the experience of specific distribution of vectorial emotions is partly linked to the individual's reference state in the form of the perception of the energetic self. This perception reflects a broad range of present beliefs, memories, and expectations, which I will discuss in a short while. Now, it is possible to reckon with the idea that we are mostly unaware of the psychoenergetics affecting our responses, as well as we are being intrinsically driven to act in ways that intensify experiences, rewarding us with positive emotions and simultaneously to avoid or attempt to minimize the impact of situations evoking negative emotions, including fears. These natural propensities are referred to here as urges, and their direct influence on the individual's never-ending search for order patterns, which is a prominent behavioral trait by itself, as well as on his or her assessments and predictions regarding self-interactions with spacetime, is treated here as free from any moral concerns in these regards. Adopting a broad viewpoint, I assume that the individual human's life is accompanied by time-evolved circumstantial distributions of urges. These momentarily converge towards dominant consciousness attractors, while forming PCEs, which presumably affect the energy perception. Now, in spite of some reasonable connections which can be drawn between fears or urges and the motivation to advance genetic goals, such as correlating the fear of death with extending survival or fear of absolute abandonment with replicating and then guardianship, due to the high complexity of the factors determining the distributions of fears and urges in every given situation, it is impossible to accurately associate them with the goals. In fact, I believe that fears and urges are often prioritized in a way that sabotages the improvement and conservation of some of the goals, and their attractors divert the human from following robotically the realization path. With that said, one can still attribute to fears and urges a prominent contribution in motivating the human to struggle over the recruitment of energy resources in attempt to fulfill, improve, and conserve his or her goals. As such, these PCEs play a backstage role in the evolutionary processes extending beyond the individual level to the entire species. Motivated by different beliefs, as well as by the fear of death and the consequent urges to resist it and postpone our demise, we are pushed to recruit excessively and work hard towards conserving and improving our perceived reserves. At the same time, an inner struggle against our fear of absolute abandonment urges our social behavior, which increases the probability of realizing the replication and its subsequent targets. Nevertheless, these same urges can also act as genetic inhibitors, counterproductively distracting the individual or even pushing him or her towards behaviors and efforts that could otherwise have been spent on recruitment and/or conservation improvement processes. The emotionally influenced fine balance between the acceleration and inhibition of genetic motivations plays a prominent role in the self-narrative of the individual human, and I identify this aspect of mind activity to be fundamental in this psychoenergetic approach. Furthermore, the multi-level impact of fears and urges on energetic assessments seems to be significant to such an extent that it can be analogized to an inner conflict in every individual's mind, a micro-scale conflict that always precedes the macro-human struggle over energy resources. Using these biased dynamics, I will now attempt to describe universal mechanisms which are believed to assist every human in energetically genetically assessing his or her own life events and experiences. These ideas lead me to believe that the assimilation of experiences and beliefs, including this process' subsequent impact on perceptions, is strongly coupled to the psychoenergetics of the human. As such, the assimilation also depends on the emotive vector distributions that the individual is experiencing during the exposure to space-time events, and among them, on the momentary projections of the core fears. One important assumption to be made at this stage is that the stronger the genetic energetic influence a certain event or entity has on one's life, which is also often expressed through his or her self-perceived projection of the influence, the greater impact it normally leaves on this individual's assimilation of beliefs associated with their direct and/or indirect interactions. This energy exchange-dependent belief assimilation effect is quite often subconscious, yet it is eminent and determines in many cases the resistance of the assimilated beliefs towards possible changes and replacement. To exemplify the energy-belief correlation, I can ascribe the strong, almost unbreakable onset grasp of religious beliefs in many believers' minds to the communication of these concepts by their guardians, who, throughout their believers' infancy and childhood life phases, were emotionally associated and regarded by them as ultimate donating sources of energy and protection. In accord with that, it is also possible to see that successive energetic dependencies throughout the lives of generations of replicating humans contribute to preserving certain beliefs and enhance their long-term resilience to changes by weaker energy impacting events. Before speculating the mechanism behind the energy perception, I would like to describe the concept of the human energetic self and distinguish it from the spatial self, which was previously mentioned in the context of the classical perception layer. Both energetic and spatial selves refer, according to my interpretation, to distribution states of specific mind arrays associated with transmissions of singularity-like PCEs, which serve as progressing self-references for the individual's core perceptions. Now, whereas the spatial self-perception relies significantly on direct, convergence-like experience, sensation, and interpretation of stimuli arriving from spacetime, a pivotal factor in the energetic self-perception, abbreviated as EP-self, is the individual's multi-level self-assessments of own energetic states in his or her external body and mind states. The assessments include, for example, evaluation of own strength, stamina, motoric abilities, motivations, self-competence, and potential possessions. These add up to frequent estimations of projected own energetic genetic achievements in the external world. Combined, the estimations promote the formation of an energetic narrative that enables the human to assess CP-recognized objects and situations from his or her unique singularity reference perspective, and ascribe to them what can be taken as potential individual or self-energetic benefits. Employing their abilities to decrypt beliefs' encrypted structures, a series of mind operators directed towards assessments of the individual's mind, body, and exterior environment harness the mind's cognitive functions to compare, interpret, and estimate the different DRS contributions to his or her energy self. These are mainly perceived as the self-potency to pursue, improve, complete, or preserve the genetic goals, in addition to the individual's solid accomplishment in this regard, or their projections on other matters. The perception of the energetic self is believed to occur in every human, regardless of his or her current aspirations or resentment to realize the goals, and independently of his or her objective capability to practically implement them. Another point to consider is that, unlike in the case of the individual human energy, which was previously introduced in the equation of dynamic balance, some of the energy components assessed in the perception of the energetic self also relate to external to the individual resources within his or her entire individual ecosystem. The assessments of external to the individual self-resources and potentials rely on broad beliefs among which I wish to highlight those concerning the ownership of spatial contents and their distributions between the living. Beliefs of this kind are known to lay the groundwork for social laws and conventions which are shared between humans in an attempt to regulate the ongoing energetic struggle. With respect to that, one can view the description of ownership and possession as contributing to the elusive from an organic perspective idea of individuality of energy in general spacetime. Next, I believe that combined, the spatial self and energetic self-perceptions set up the unified narrative of the individual self. This new, spatial energetic combined reference points approach to define the self differs from classical interpretations, including those established by John Locke, Thomas Reid, and others. So in summarizing this part, the energetic self is believed to reflect mind distribution shaped by methodical assessments. It yields some sort of a pseudo-quantitative index of self-energetic genetic achievements and potencies. The different DRS-focused perceptions correlated with this mind element are hypothesized as serving as a reference point for certain cognitive processes which play a critical role in energy perception-directed human sensory responses. Combined, the perceptions of the energetic self and the classical spatial self form a unified self-perception which accounts for the, ideally coherent, narrative of the individual. It is possible to assume that the awareness to the energetic self-perception is intermittent and that the mind areas involved in its generation employ different belief-encrypted structures stored memories. I also believe that overarching effects reduce the objectivity and organic credibility of the assessments and predictions entailed, as well as increase their apparent complexity.